Hello everyone, this is Chromý and together we will continue the course Interdisciplinary Approaches to Language and its Use. In this presentation we will focus on conversation from psycholinguistic perspective. This is an area of study which has been somehow overlooked in psycholinguistics for a long time. One of the reasons is that it is hard to conduct experimental research on conversation. However, it has attracted quite some attention during the last 20 years. Moreover, conversation is a joint activity which can reveal us many potential important aspects of language processing we might otherwise overlook while studying production or comprehension of isolated utterances. This is a short excerpt of a conversation between two interlocutors, Vera and Jenny. It comes from a study by Emanuel Schlegelov, who is a well-known researcher in the field of conversation analysis. You can see that the conversation is transcribed using a specific transcription rules, which we do not need to understand fully for our current purposes. But what we can see is that the conversation has many features which differ from isolated utterances. It contains various disfluencies, such as hesitations. The interlocutors are taking turns. There is some overlap in their speech which is marked by square brackets. And the speech is syntactically clumsy. In sum, there is nothing exceptional on this particular conversation. In fact, we may say that it shows many features which are very typical for this type of interaction. When we compare conversation with a monologue, especially with a prepared one, we can see that there are various features which are typical for conversation. Conversation tends to be elliptical and often incomplete in what information it conveys. Interlocutors have only a limited possibility to plan their utterances. They are taking turns, which is often associated with overlaps in their speech. And the interlocutors receive feedback from each other, at least implicitly. It may thus seem that conversation should be much harder to do, but the opposite is actually true. Conversation may be quite easy, especially with someone you know well. The question is why? Why is conversation easy, considering its features I just mentioned? Precisely this question has been asked in a study by Simon Garrott and Martin Pickering. The authors introduce a key concept of interactive alignment. They argue that conversation is a joint activity and that the communication partners aim to establish a joint understanding of what they are talking about. The communication partners therefore tend to align their linguistic representations at different levels. Importantly, the process of alignment is largely unconscious. The interlocutors align in their choice of words, sounds, grammatical forms, and also meanings. Garrott and Pickering claim that to come to a common understanding, interlocutors need to align their situation models. Roughly speaking, a situation model is a general cognitive representation of what we talk about, and it contains information about the relevant individuals, spatial and temporal information, information about causality and intentions, and so on. We will return to situation models in more detail in one of the forthcoming presentations. In another study from 2013, Martin Pickering and Simon Garrott posit an integrated theory of language production and comprehension. Until now, we have discussed language production independently from language comprehension. This is a typical approach in psycholinguistics. However, Pickering and Garrott claim that production and comprehension processes are interwoven. In other words, when we produce language, we use both mechanisms of production and comprehension. And while we listen to someone or while we read, we use both the mechanisms of comprehension and production too. This may seem a bit odd at first, but the arguments for this idea are quite strong and come from various studies employing differing methods. The crucial thing for the whole theory is the assumption that the processes of production and comprehension heavily lie in prediction. In other words, we use our own experiences and world knowledge to predict both what the other person will say and what we will personally say. Pickering and Garrott differentiate between the so-called prediction by simulation and prediction by association. Prediction by simulation is based on experience producing utterances, and it basically means that we internally simulate what the other person is saying. One of the arguments for this is inner speech. For example, we know that our articulatory organs are active during listening, which gives an evidence for simulation. Prediction by association is based on the experience of comprehending others. The authors stress out that both types of prediction are important for communication, but the central one is the prediction by simulation, because it can, for example, explain why we can react so rapidly on each other. They say that the prediction by association is used more when the interlocutors do not know each other, or when the simulation would be complicated, for example, when talking to a child. Importantly, prediction occurs at different linguistic levels: semantics, syntax, and phonology. This is the model of producing an utterance by Pickering and Garrott. In the top left corner, you can see the production command, which is called I, in the time called T. This command initiates two processes. First, it goes to the production implementer, whose output is an utterance, which is a sequence of sounds that encodes semantics, syntax, and phonology. The speaker herself perceives and comprehends this utterance and creates a percept of this utterance. Second, an internal copy of the production command is created, which is called an efference copy. This copy feeds into the forward production model, which outputs a predicted utterance. Based on this predicted utterance, a predicted utterance percept is generated by the forward comprehension model. Then, the monitor can compare the utterance percept and the predicted utterance percept and perform self-monitoring. On this slide, there is a model of the process of comprehension. Above the thick line, at the top of the schema, there is the unfolding utterance by speaker B. When the speaker A hears B's utterance at time t, she covertly imitates it. This means she creates the utterance percept via the comprehension implementer and then uses the inverse model and context to derive the production command that A would use if A were to produce B's utterance. From this, the production command in time t+1 is created, which is associated with the next part of the speaker B's utterance. Then, an efference copy is created, as we saw in the production model, and via the forward production model, a predicted utterance at time t+1 is created. With the use of the forward comprehension model, the predicted utterance percept is created, which is then compared by the monitor with the real utterance percept. Importantly, the covert imitation may lead straight to overt responses. For example, when the speaker A takes the turn and ends the utterance instead of speaker B. At last, this is the model of the conversational interaction as a joint action. Both speakers A and B are predicting B's forthcoming utterance. Speaker B's production command I at time t goes into B's production implementer and results in an utterance P. Speaker A covertly imitates this utterance and uses her forward production model to predict the forthcoming utterance at time t+1. At the same time, speaker B creates the next production command and through her forward production model, she creates a prediction of her forthcoming utterance. Speaker B's and Speaker A's predictions should match, and they may also match B's actual utterance at the time t+1, which is not shown in this schema. I assume this model may be quite intricate to you at first, but it makes much sense, especially when you read the whole paper and consider it in relation to various experimental findings the authors cite. Before we will conclude this presentation, I have one reading tip for you. As I said, the covert imitation is narrowly related to the inner speech. Inner speech is a very interesting phenomenon which plays an important role in human language processing. Unfortunately, we do not have time to discuss it here. Therefore, I recommend you to read the study Inner Speech, Development, Cognitive Functions, Phenomenology and Neurobiology by Ben Alderson-Day and Charles Fernihug. If you enjoyed the presentations, we would be glad if you would like them on YouTube. That is all from me now. See you next time.